Today I'm going to give you an intro to biology and the nature of science. The goal of this video is to help you learn how to describe what scientists do in general and what biologists do in particular. So let's begin with this question. Why should you care about science? Well, once you understand what science is, the answer to the question is pretty simple. Our word science comes from the Latin word for knowledge. Basically, science is a method we use to gain knowledge of the physical world. And the physical world is all of nature, from the really, really big stuff, like galaxies and black holes, to the really, really small stuff, like atoms and subatomic particles. One reason you should care about science is that it's really useful. Knowing how the physical world works helps us out a lot. For example, it helps us predict the future. And you may think, really? How is that? Well, think about the weather. If you know what causes snow and rain, what weather patterns cause that, then you're going to be able to predict what can happen tomorrow or the next day or so on when it comes to the weather. Science also increases our quality of life. So think of medicine. When we know what causes certain problems within our bodies, then we can look for solutions, how to solve those problems, and increase our quality of life. Okay, now that's why science is useful. But this class is not just about science in general, this is about biology. So, what is biology? It's essentially the science of life, and let's break this down a bit. So, our word biology comes from two Greek words. The first is bios, which means life, and the second is logos, which means study. You put the words together and you see that it's the study of life. Biology is the study of living things and how they interact with the environment. Now, what does this actually look like in real life? Well, that's a question about what biologists do. This list isn't exhaustive. It doesn't include everything the biologists do, but it gives you a good idea. So the first is biologists study animal behavior. And I'll give you an example of a real life scientist, Jane Goodall. You might have heard of her. She studied how chimpanzees gathered food, the kinds of tools they use, what causes them to be aggressive, and so on. And scientists can then use what Jane Goodall and others have learned to better help protect chimpanzees. A second example is that biologists research diseases. So biologists ask questions like, what causes some disease? Could be Alzheimer's, it could be HIV, it could be cancer. What causes this? How does the body fight it? How does such a disease spread? And so on. In the picture here, you can see chickenpox. So they can ask all these questions about chickenpox. And once they learn what causes chickenpox and how it spreads and so on, how the body fights it, they can actually develop a vaccine to help fight it. Okay, a third example of what biologists do, they develop new technologies. And I'm not talking about necessarily computers, though they can certainly use computers in what they do. But for example, gene editing. So gene editing is a method that scientists have developed where they can actually remove sections of your DNA that can cause problems. So maybe there's a gene that tends to cause cancer in people. And they can locate that gene and remove it and then replace it with a new piece of DNA that won't cause problems. So that's an example of gene editing. So biologists do develop technologies. A fourth example is they improve agriculture. So biologists can actually genetically engineer plants to grow in poor soil that doesn't have a whole lot of nutrients. They can genetically engineer these plants to grow with less water and resist various infections and even resist frost damage. So if there is a frost, it may not harm the plant. They can genetically engineer plants to do these things. And this allows crops to grow in areas they normally wouldn't. And that in turn improves food production to feed the world's growing population. Here's a fifth example of what biologists do. They help preserve environments. Okay, so that could be they help preserve some area in the water. We'll talk later in this year about how there's pollution, trash that ends up in our oceans. So they might try to fight that. But they also seek to protect endangered species. That's part of preserving the environment as well. So, for example, blue whales, they are an endangered species and because they were overhunted in the 1800s by commercial whalers. And scientists now work to protect them and help the population grow to prevent them from going extinct. So, those are some of the things that biologists do. Now, how are you going to use this information in this class this year? Well, biologists aim to understand living things and use that knowledge to help solve real world problems. So, in this first unit, you're going to learn how to think like a scientist. And you're going to do that by doing two things. I'm going to teach you how to design experiments to test claims, and I'm going to teach you how to use evidence and reasoning to assess the truth of those claims. So, we'll design experiments to test a claim, and whatever results we get, we're going to use that as evidence and we're going to use reasoning to assess the truth of the claim that was made. You actually do this all the time and you may not even realize it. So, in the next video, I'm going to teach you the basic steps of experimental design that scientists use, and then you're going to begin using those to design your own experiments.